Welcome back. So, are you ready to start creating some parameters that we can drive our animations with? Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so here we are. Just to recap, we're in Mecanim. We're looking at an animation controller for our character here. And we've already gotten this idle clip in here, this float. So it's going to float up and down kind of lazily, all of its own accord. So until we tell it to do anything different, right, the float's just going to happen. This is our transition. This is our default clip. All right, a few things we can do here. We can create parameters, right? A parameter is something that will drive or control some aspect of our animation. So the simplest one we can create here, I'm going to select my default, is our speed, right? Let's click on parameter. Oops, we'll have to create one first. All right, so let's click on the tab over here that says parameters. And let's click on this plus button, all right? A parameter is just a variable. And you can see we have 4 types of variables. We have a float, we know what that is, it's a number with decimal points. We have an integer, which is a whole number. We have a boolean, which is an on or off switch, like a toggle. And we have a trigger. Now, trigger is kind of a new one in terms of our understanding of variables. Okay? A trigger is kind of like a mouse down. It only fires once. So it happens one time, and it only evaluates as true for the 1 split second that it happens, and then it goes back to untrue. And this is really great for a jump animation, right? Or a fire animation, or a swing hit with a punch animation. The reason is because we can trigger the animation once, but we're not going to keep triggering it, right? Because if the button is held down, it will only happen one time. And when it's over, it'll go back to its initial position. And that's really important when we start looking at the transitions. So the trigger is going to be something we're going to really want to use if we want to just trigger a single off animation. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a float value. And that float value is going to be called idle speed. What does that mean? That means that I'm going to tie this variable. Let's make it 0.3. I'm going to tie this variable into this animation clip here. So speed 0.274, let's say, instead of it being a number that I hard code, I'm going to make it a parameter. Why is this? Well, what I want to be able to do is at any time during the gameplay, I want to be able to say, look, he's getting a little excited or he's wounded. Or something is happening to get your attention. And based on the laws of humans being predators, we tend to notice fast movement out of the corner of our eye really fast. He'll get your attention if he moves faster. So if you're in a game and you're playing, you have this idle speed, and then suddenly he starts bouncing up and down really fast, this gets your attention. So I want to be able to get the player's attention at any given moment simply by changing a value anywhere in my code. So this idle speed here is a parameter that can be exposed. And I guess it's going to... Unfortunately, we can set this to any decimal point in code. In the actual game editor, it'll always round it up to the nearest tenth. So that's just something that it does. It's not going to do that when we put in the code. It'll actually give us a value that could be to the 100th. All right, so what I've done here is created a parameter I can then expose in the code, and I can change his idle speed at any given point. I can make it shorter, or I can make it longer, or I can speed it up and slow it down, etc. And that's how these parameters work. All right, let's create a new parameter. And I'm going to create a trigger. And this trigger is going to be spin trigger. Because eventually what I'm going to do is we're going to trigger an animation based on this spin trigger. So I'm going to set it up. Now, it's a toggle, right? It's a trigger, so I turn it on once. And it will evaluate as true for a moment, and then it'll cease to evaluate as true. And that's the nature of the trigger. I did say trigger, right? Yes, trigger. Okay. So it is a toggle, but that toggle is only evaluated once. So once I set the trigger as true, it will immediately set itself as false. Generally, that speaking happens in the code. Here it kind of stays as a Boolean. But once we trigger it in code, it will only remain true for a split second. So it'll fire off whatever animation that we want, and it'll go back to its original state. All right, so that's pretty much how we set up those parameters. Now, if we look at our clip here, we can set some other stuff. We can mirror animations, pretty cool. So we only need really a turn left animation or a lean forward animation. We can generate a second state and then use that animation and mirror it, right? And we can also change the speed to a negative value. So you'll see some of those things happen as we mess around with the parameters when we start loading in extra clips and creating transitions between the idle animation and triggered animations, which you can look forward to coming up in just a moment.